Hey guys, tonight we're visiting a world where people didn't wake up early to be productive. They woke up early to survive. Welcome to medieval Europe, where the sunrise wasn't your alarm clock. The cold was. And trust me, it didn't hit snooze. So before you get all cozy in bed, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I create here. And let me know where you're listening from in the comments and what time it is. I always love seeing who's joining this sleepy little journey from all around the world. Now, turn off the lights, switch on a fan if you like that soft, humming white noise, and let's gently slip into tonight's story. Imagine living in a tiny wooden hut in the middle of January 1347. Outside, the east wind howls and snow clings to the roof like a layer of crushed ice. Inside, your entire family, 2 generations and 1 goat, are curled up on a low straw bed, huddled under a thin wool blanket that's been patched 3 times. There's no fireplace in the bedroom, no insulation, and your window is just a hole with a wooden shutter. The cold doesn't just creep in, it sits next to you and stays the night. If you're thinking of sleeping in a little longer, well, back then, sleeping in meant waking up with purple cheeks, a frozen nose, and toes you couldn't feel anymore. So, people in the past got up early. Not because they loved hard work at dawn, but because sleeping too long could mean never waking up again. The first person to rise in your house is usually your mother. Her hands tremble as she lifts the blanket, but she knows the fire must be rekindled immediately. Because if there's no flame within an hour of waking, breakfast will just be the cold pressing straight into your bones. You step out of bed. The straw crackles underfoot. She stirs the cold ashes in the hearth, hoping to find a few lingering embers. If she does, she blows gently, adding a handful of twigs. If not, well, it's a morning of striking flint and wrestling with coarse wool. Meanwhile, the children begin to stir. They groan, not from laziness, but from icy hands, freezing feet, and damp pillows. Your father is securing a cowhide strip over the door crack, muttering, "North wind. Tonight'll be even worse." There's no toast or soft butter for breakfast. Maybe just a bowl of last night's cold porridge reheated if the fire catches. You head outside. The wind stings your eyes. You clutch a bundle of firewood, feet crunching over thin, brittle ice. In the distance, smoke curls from other chimneys, a quiet signal that these houses are still alive. No one talks about waking up on time. Here, on time means before the cold can kill you. You look around. In the fields, a few figures check the chicken coop. An older woman uses a tuft of dry grass to shield her head, hunching over to knock ice from the window frame. Everyone knows that warmth isn't waiting for you. You have to fight for it, every single morning. Nights are bitter and protracted, but morning is hope. And the way medieval people kept that hope alive was by waking early, before the chill reached the marrow, before snow buried the door, before everything in the house froze. Even your will. You can sleep in today. But if you were living in the 14th century, that decision to stay under the covers just 5 more minutes, it might be the last morning you'd ever feel. If you've ever thought your mattress was a bit firm, try imagining sleeping on a layer of dry straw spread over wooden planks. No sheets, no heating, and just a blanket as thin as a cracker laid over the top. That was the standard bed for an average European in the Middle Ages. And in that world, straw wasn't just straw. It was the thing standing between you and a cold that could paralyze your spine. People didn't use straws simply because they were cheap. They used it because they knew how to hold heat. Each dry stalk of straw is a tiny, hollow tube, trapping air inside. And air, when kept still between layers of material, is one of the most effective insulators. A fresh pile of newly replaced straw could hold warmth through the whole night. You just lie down, your body weight pressing the top layers, and the heat radiating from you would stay trapped in the air between the stalks. That's how people survived winter, when even the floor felt like a headstone. Every evening before bed, someone would fluff the straw. Not to tidy up, but to make it puff again, loosening the compressed bits and helping air circulate better. It was the 14th century version of making your bed. You might think straw is nothing special, but in winter, it was a treasure. Families with more clean, dry straw meant more warm nights, fewer coughs, and less risk of freezing. Older folks stuffed straw into the corners of the bed, around the back, the legs, much like someone today curling up with an electric blanket. Children were usually placed higher on thicker piles to avoid the ground chill. Some households even laid straws around the sleeping area to block drafts. Where there was straw, there was warmth. And there was no smell where the straw was dry and unmolded. A crucial detail. If you've ever slept on damp straws, you'd instantly understand why medieval people laundered their bedding straws regularly. Yes, they re-dried it every few weeks or switched to fresh straw entirely. They also sprayed it with herbs, mint, rosemary, sometimes garlic, not just to deter bugs, but to soften the feeling that you were sleeping in a barn instead of a bedroom. On the coldest nights, people would even pile straw over themselves, burrowing into it like a nest. And if you stuck out your foot in the morning and still felt it, you knew the straw had done its job. Straw also served as an emergency shelter for cats, dogs, and the occasional stray chicken. There's an old folk tale about a boy who overslept in the straw and woke up next to 3 eggs. No one asked where they came from, only that it must have been a warm night. Some villages even had a winter straw-changing festival. Nothing elaborate, everyone replacing old straw, drying the used pile, and burning the damp bits. According to many, the smell of burning straw was the scent of hope. If you've ever sat by a fire on a freezing night, wrapped in a thin wool blanket, and listened to the soft rustle of straw beneath you, you'll understand why medieval people cherished it so profoundly. It wasn't beautiful, it wasn't luxurious, but it saved lives every single night, a little at a time. To us today, fire's a switch, a microwave beep, a button on the stove. But in the Middle Ages, fire was life. And to get a flame, small enough to fit in your palm, but strong enough to boil yesterday's cold soup, you needed more than just a match. You needed skill and patience and a little luck, the kind that stops the east wind from killing your spark. Picture a winter morning. The ashes in the hearth have gone cold overnight. The wind howls through the doorframe, and while the whole family shivers, you, the designated fire starter, crouch by the hearth with a piece of flint, muttering like you're summoning a spirit from the underworld. You begin with the most minor things: dry bark, straw scraps, bits of flax, and maybe wood shavings from an old spoon. You arrange them carefully into a tiny nest, not for birds, but for flame. Then you take the flint. One hand holds steel, the other strikes down hard. A spark flies, but it misses. You strike again. Your fingers go numb. The wind sneaks up your sleeves, but you keep going because no one wants to be the one who let the fire die. Then, after 30 strikes and 3 eyefuls of ash, a tiny light flares. It catches the straw. You stop breathing, blow gently. The fire leaps up like it's just agreed to let you live another day. You cheer quietly, not too loud, or the wind might hear you, but loud enough for Grandma to know breakfast won't be cold. Keeping the fire going was an art form. Today, a gas line does the work. Back then, they kept fire with ash and instinct. After every meal, people didn't snuff the flames. They buried them under a layer of ash, not to kill them, but to cradle them, like tucking in a temperamental child, ready to roar back to life at dawn. If you did it right, the next morning, you just stir it, add a straw, and flames would return like they never left. If not, you'd start all over, and the family would look at you like you robbed them of hot porridge. Some people in the village were called fire keepers. Not an official title, just those who had the rare talent of keeping flames alive through all of winter. Their homes smelled faintly of smoke, and neighbors would come by not for sugar, but for a glowing ember. Yes, back then, a glowing coal was a gift, sometimes more precious than salt. If your fire went out, you'd wrap a wooden shovel in leather and walk to your neighbor's house to borrow fire. And no one refused, because fire was the one thing you could give away and still have more of. There were fire-keeping tricks we've long forgotten. 1. Hanging wood high to keep it dry. 2. Stuffing cloth soaked in oil between stones to hold heat overnight. 3. Heating pebbles in the embers to use as makeshift hot water bottles. Medieval folks didn't have lighters, but they knew how to raise a fire like it was a child. Feed it straw on time, don't starve it, don't smother it, and above all, protect it from the wind. Sometimes the rains came, the fire died, the house went black, the wind howled like a stray dog at the door, and the family huddled together, not for love, but for warmth. You'd lift the stove lid and sift through the ashes. Your hands would shake, but you'd still hope that a spark was hiding somewhere in there. Just one member, one breath, one chance to bring the light back, and if you found it, you'd never forget that moment. It felt like finding your fire. The fire didn't just cook food, it soothed throats, it dried wet sleeves, it healed cracked fingers, and above all, it comforted the soul. No one wants to sleep in the cold dark without a flicker of warmth, without proof that life is still burning nearby. So if you have an electric stove, a warm switch, or even a candle today, remember, once people bent low, breathed into ash, borrowed coals, and cradled fire in their sleeves, to survive until morning. After successfully starting the fire and keeping your family warm, the next thing a medieval person needed to survive a brutal winter was the first layer of the skin, the woolen undergarment. Yes, a small, thick, often itchier-than-life wool shirt might be between you and a January death. Don't imagine people in the Middle Ages swanning around in 5 layers of embroidered silk like in paintings. That was for nobility, and only on feast days, for peasants, villagers, artisans, and anyone surviving snow without a private hearth. The woolen underlayer was the unsung hero. It wasn't pretty, it didn't smell good, and it wasn't soft. It was thick, it was scratchy, and it always had stray threads poking at your neck like medieval acupuncture. But it came with one superpower. It stayed warm when wet. That's what made wool special. If you wore linen or coarse cloth, your sweat would soak it, and you'd be stuck with a freezing, clammy rag clinging to your back. But wool absorbed the moisture into its fibers, trapped air between them, and kept you warm. You could walk through snow in a damp wool shirt and survive. That's why every person clung to their one wool underlayer like it was sacred. If it was old, they patched it. If it was long, they trimmed it. If it tore, they stitched it. If it itched, too bad. But if it kept you warm, that was everything. There's even a story about a man in northern England who wore the same wool shirt for 3 winters straight without washing it. The village called him the Walking Wall. But nobody laughed when, that same year, he was the only one who didn't cough for 3 straight months. Wool shirts were emergency blankets too. If a guest stayed over, someone would lay a thick wool shirt on straw and tuck it like a sushi roll. And wool wasn't just in shirts. It showed up as pants, hats, socks, and scarves the size of pillowcases. All handmade, of course, by grandma, mother, and sisters. By the women who never stopped thinking about the cold creeping closer. Another fun fact, the smell of wool. Not everyone could stomach it. Linen smelled clean. Silk smelled sweet. But wool? Wool smelled like a mix of smoke, sweat, and a faint hint of goat. But that, too, was the smell of life. Body scent clung to fabric in a world without artificial perfumes, and fabric held memory. A child could smell their mother's shirt and feel safe. A wife could hug her husband's wool top while he was out hunting, and somehow know that he'd return with snow in his hair. We have thermal layers, 3-in-1 tech gear, and windproof microfiber today. Back then, just wool. Not waterproof. Not antimicrobial. But full of soul. When you put on an old wool shirt, you're wearing the care of the hands who knit it. The breath of the kitchen where it dried. The survival of 100 nights before. You might ask, why didn't they use something softer? The answer is, soft tears easily. Soft doesn't last. And the cold isn't kind to softness anyway. That night, as you sit by the hearth, your wool shirt tinged with firewood, you might take it off and hang it near the flame. Let the last sweat of the day dry out. And in the morning, when you slip it back on, head through the neck hole, you'll feel just a little of yesterday's warmth still clinging there. A whisper from yesterday, warming you for today. Today, we choose clothes for style. But in the past, they chose them to avoid an early grave. So, if you ever complain that your sweater is a bit scratchy, heavy, or just not cute enough, imagine wearing it in a snow-covered cottage, the wind pouring in, the fire going out, and the whole village sleeping under straw. In that moment, that itchy sweater, it's your guardian angel. If you lived in the 14th century, there's a good chance your house was plastered with dung. Not because of a lack of materials, not because you had a quirky affection for unusual smells, but because the mixture of mud and dry cow dung was one of the best insulators medieval people had ever discovered. Surprisingly, it worked so well that rural parts of Europe kept using it well into the 20th century. This charming blend, known as wattle and daub, or more affectionately, cow dung walls, was a type of humble wall made with woven wooden frames, then smeared with a thick paste of mud, straw, ash, and yes, the most crucial ingredient, dried manure. Sound terrifying? Maybe. But to survive a medieval winter, you had to be practical, not poetic. So why dung? First, it was everywhere. If you had cows, goats, or even neighbors with grass-eating four-legged friends, the raw materials were all over your yard, free of charge. Second, properly dried and mixed dung doesn't smell. Really. Once processed, sun-dried, and finely crushed, all that's left is a springy, fibrous texture with excellent thermal retention. Third, it was durable. When applied correctly, a dung-plastered wall could last a century, resisting storm winds, hail, and the occasional curious wolf. Picture this. You're a young farmer. You've just built a wooden frame for your home. You have no bricks, no mortar. But you have several tubs of mud, a pile of straw, and a sunlit courtyard full of crispy cow patties. You and your brothers get to work, mixing the ingredients into a sticky paste. Then, using your hands, an old shoe, or maybe even a pig bone, you start smearing the walls. Layer after layer, your house starts taking shape, like a birthday cake, made of earth and old grass. Once dried under the sun, the result is hard as stone, warm as coal, and bug-resistant. Come wintertime, these walls became your best defense. They locked in the warmth from your fire. They blocked the wind. They turned your humble hut into a cozy cave in a snow-covered world. There was even a folk saying, "A house with an old smell is a house that outlives its owners." And yes, that old smell came from walls that once mooed. You might ask, why not build with stone? Well, if you were a noble, sure. But the stone is cold. A wind against a stone wall chills the whole room. But dung and mud? Software breathable. Surprisingly snug. Some even used dung walls as public notice boards. They held pins well, and messages scratched into them lasted the whole season. And there were unexpected perks. Soft, slick walls like these were wolf-proof, no grip for claws. And mouse-resistant, rodents hated climbing walls laced with ash and herbs. On the coldest nights, families would sit right next to the walls. Not to admire their handiwork, but to soak up the heat the walls had stored from daytime. Dung plaster became the family's giant blanket. Today, we rely on drywall, polyurethane foam, and triple-insulated panels. But back then, they just needed dried poop, some mud, and patience. Sounds simple? It is. But the next time you sit inside your climate-controlled home, remember, your ancestors once survived an ice-crusted winter using nothing but what dropped from the back end of a cow. And the most beautiful part? They weren't ashamed. They were proud of walls that stood firm, kept warm, and didn't flinch when the wind howled. If something got damp, they dried it. If it cracked, they patched it. If winter came, they moved closer. Because they knew, survival doesn't have to be pretty. It just has to hold. If you think medieval people slept through the night like we do today, think again. In truth, they didn't sleep in one solid block of 8 hours. They slept in 2 distinct phases. And oddly enough, it might have saved their lives. They called it first sleep and second sleep. 2 rounds of sleep in one night. Not because of insomnia, but because it was a clever adaptation to cold, darkness, and the isolation of a world without clocks or electricity. Picture this. You're living in a thatched roof cottage in the dead of winter. There's no light after sundown. The sun sets at 5 p.m. and is pitch black by 9. You, your parents, siblings, and maybe even a neighbor or two are curled together under rough wool and dry straw while the wind howls through the shutters. The first sleep starts around 8 or 9 p.m. Everyone slips into silence. Bodies press close for warmth. No chatting. No chores. The night is long, and sleep is a form of survival. But then, around midnight, something curious happens. You wake up, not startled, not interrupted, just awake. It is as if some ancient biological bell inside your chest rings true. This in-between time is known as the watch, or the waking between sleeps. A quiet period from about 1 a.m. to 3 a.m., when people would sit up, stir the fire, stretch, or tend to personal rituals. Some would pray, some would mend clothes, others would talk in low voices, whispering the kinds of conversations only darkness makes possible. Several diaries mention when people felt most clear-headed, like their minds opened up when the world was fast asleep, and then, after an hour or two, people would slip back under the covers. Second sleep began, usually deeper, warmer, and lasting until the first rooster crowed or pale light crept across the sky. This wasn't just a sleep pattern, it was a survival strategy. Waking in the middle of the night allowed people to check the fire, plug drafts, or ensure the baby hadn't frozen in the cradle. It allowed them to listen for thieves, or worse, wolves. And most of all, it helped break up the cold. Because when you split the night into 2, the chill didn't press down quite as hard nor creep quite so deep into your bones. In some regions, the midnight watch was used to tend livestock, check lambs, or replace damp straw for sleeping animals. You couldn't do that at dawn. Morning frost was more dangerous than night cold. There's even evidence that many couples use this time for intimacy, whispered affection in the dark, quiet house while the fire flickered low, and the mind was just lucid enough for tenderness. Today, if you wake at 2 a.m., you might panic, think something's wrong with you. But in the 14th century, 2 a.m. was golden hour, a time for thinking, mending, praying, or adjusting the sock that slipped off your frozen foot. Segmented sleep helped the body remain flexible and helped the mind stay sane before heated bedrooms and electric clocks. It was a forgotten rhythm, a lost survival hack before modern lighting hijacked our circadian instincts. So maybe tonight, try it. Split your night in two. Don't panic if you wake up at midnight. Don't reach for your phone. Just lie there, take a breath, and think, I've just stepped into the medieval night. Then, like they once did, you'll slip gently back into your second sleep, and when morning comes, you'll realize you didn't just sleep. You lived through the night like your ancestors once did. In the Middle Ages, surviving winter wasn't just about staying warm. It was about filling your stomach, even if only with a spoonful of watery porridge. There were no supermarkets, no refrigerators, and indeed no food delivery. When the ground froze and the harvest slept, people made do with whatever was left from autumn. And the miracle is, they managed. They ate things that would make us today shake our heads. But to them, it was a precious ticket to survival. A typical breakfast. Porridge was made from oats, barley, or whatever grain was still in the jar. No milk, no sugar. If lucky, maybe a few beans or chopped turnips left from weeks before. Porridge wasn't just food. It was warm energy. It wrapped the belly in comfort and temporarily tricked the brain into thinking, we're okay. The clever bit? Medieval people could make porridge using old boiling water, leftover vegetable broth, yesterday's stew, and even water from boiled dumplings. They believed, rightly so, that every drop that had touched food still held a bit of life. No porridge? Then came black bread, made from coarse barley or rye, the kind of grains nobles sneered at. But these tough little grains were resilient. They are stored well. They didn't mold fast. Black bread was baked hard, like bricks. You had to soak it or warm it by the fire to soften the memory before biting in. But it lasted. It didn't spoil, and one loaf could feed a small family for 3 days. And if even black bread ran out, it was time to eat bark. You heard that right? People peeled the inner bark from birch, elm, or ash trees, dried it, ground it into powder, and mixed it into porridge or bread dough. Not tasty, but it had fiber, a mild woody flavor. Most importantly, it made the stomach feel less empty. Many accounts from that time describe mothers venturing into the forest, peeling bark gently, like they were picking herbs, because to them, winter trees weren't asleep. They were waiting to help. Beyond porridge, bread, and bark, there were turnips. Turnips survived underground even through frost. People buried them in straw, deep in cellars, so they could still eat them in January. Cabbage? It was pickled, becoming a tangy vegetable to balance meals stripped of vitamins. Beans? Dried in summer, soaked with ash water to make them cook faster. Meat? Rare. And when available, it was smoked, hung above the hearth, saved for special days, or visiting nobles. The strange thing is that medieval people didn't eat much, not because they were on a diet, but because they had nothing more. Yet they still lived. I still worked in the fields, still gave birth, built homes, laughed, sometimes with just a bowl of porridge and a piece of tooth-breaking bread. They had a skill we've lost. They knew how to feel complete with very little. One older woman once recalled a harsh winter. That village shared onion soup. If lucky, one boiling pot, a single onion, a few cloves of garlic, and salt. No one complained. No one frowned, because they knew a warm belly was enough. Today, when we have the luxury of choosing from hundreds of dishes, remember your ancestors once treated watery porridge as a comfort meal, tree bark as a seasoning, and rock-hard bread as something worth its weight in gold. Because to survive, you don't need a gourmet menu, just something warm you can swallow. In the Middle Ages, if your home had a pile of dry firewood and a glowing hearth that lasted through the night, you were living like a little king. But don't be fooled into thinking that keeping the fire going was as simple as lighting it and letting the embers smolder. In the 14th century, tending the hearth was an art form, and no one took it lightly. Picture a winter night, wind howling through the thatched roof. The house is pitch dark, except for the embers' faint glow in the clay oven. Beneath straw blankets, everyone is curled up tight, but one person keeps their eyes open, the one who sleeps closest to the fire. That person is the firekeeper. No bells, no reminders. They simply watch the flame, listen for crackles, smell the smoke, and know what must be done. When the fire starts to fade, they don't wait until it's gone. They wait for the right moment, like a musician striking the last note with perfect timing. Why such care? Because firewood was precious. All summer, families chopped, dried, and stored every stick they could. Wet wood wouldn't burn. Worse, it would smoke and poison the air. Wood too small burned too quickly, too large, and it would suffocate the flame. The firekeeper knew the balance. A small kindling to ignite, a medium log to sustain, a large piece to radiate warmth through the night. It was like composing music. One mistimed note could ruin the whole piece. It wasn't just about adding logs, it was also about arranging them. Logs had to be placed so air could flow, not too tight, not leaning the wrong way. Some village elders could glance at a hearth and immediately say, "Logs are against the wind. Smoke will flood the room." And smoke wasn't just annoying, it was a sign the fire was choking. The family would wake up to purple toes and a biting cold if the fire died overnight. That's why the firekeeper was someone trusted. They didn't sleep deeply. They didn't speak much. But they listened to the breath of the fire as if it were the heartbeat of the household. They rose in the dark to turn the wood, stir the coals, and gently brush away ash with a straw broom. If needed, they gave up part of their blanket and sat closer to the hearth, so the rest of the family could sleep in peace. Some households rotated fire duty. Others had one person watch the whole season. But all knew the truth. If the fire dies, warmth dies. And fire doesn't always come back when called. The fire was life. But wood was the food it needed. And feeding that fire just right was the difference between a cozy night and one spent curled up like a leaf in frost. There were tricks, too. Dipping one end of a log in ash to slow its burn. Drying wood near the roof but shielding it from morning dew. Saving tiny splinters and shavings as kindling. The first flames of the morning. If you woke and the fire still had glowing coals, you'd know the firekeeper had done their job. No one clapped. But that warmth was reward enough. Sometimes, just one red ember was enough to start a new day. Today, we press buttons for heat, turn knobs, walk away. But our ancestors stayed up through the night, silent and still, tending each stick as if caring for a soul. The fire wasn't a convenience. It was the heart of the home. And the firekeeper, in silence, in darkness, was the one who kept life quietly burning. Not everyone in the Middle Ages had a bow and arrow, hunting dogs, or the strength to chase down a rabbit. But everyone had a piece of string. And sometimes they could catch dinner with nothing more than a hemp cord, a bent stick, and a rock. A trap, quite literally, was the intelligence of the hungry. And for a poor peasant in the 14th century, a well-placed snare was more valuable than a well. You didn't need much to make one. A flexible or naturally curved branch, a rough twisted hemp string, a bit of bait, a dried turnip, bread crust, or anything with a scent. Medieval folks knew the habits of every creature around the village. Rabbits skimmed past thorn bushes at dawn. Weasels passed through cabbage gardens by night. Field mice? Drawn to the old smells of a cold hearth. So they picked the right spot, the right time, and the right trick. Some traps were simple snares, a looped string across an animal trail. The knot tightened around its leg when the creature stepped in and tugged. Others used a bent branch as a trigger. When the animal bit the bait, the stick snapped upright, hoisting it off the ground, quietly, suddenly, and efficiently. Some relied on weight, a rock balanced, ready to fall with a twitch of movement, right onto a tail. No metal, no machinery, just observation, experience, and patience. A 9-year-old could set mouse traps around the grain shed. An older woman could rig a rabbit snare with a frayed drawstring. And if you were heading into the woods, no knife needed, just knowing where to set a trap. And traps weren't just for food. People laid traps around chicken coops, to catch thieves, in front of gardens, to catch foxes, even inside the house, to catch those who shouldn't sneak in at night. Yes, traps were part of village security too. You might ask, isn't that a bit cruel? Because they didn't hunt for fun. They set traps for a meal. Not every trap succeeded, but one large rat could be dinner. A rabbit, a meal for the whole family. And a weasel? That was next season's coat. Nothing went to waste. Everything caught was used. Skin became hats. Bones became broth. Fur stuffed pillows. And the meat was smoked and stored. Most importantly, children were taught to trap from a young age. Not to hunt, but to observe. They learned to read tracks in the snow, to tell the difference between a mouse nibble and a rabbit bite, to know exactly which spot in the fence a sly weasel liked to squeeze through. And when they set their first trap, even if it only caught a toad, it was a small victory in the big game of winter survival. Today, we talk about survival skills as a weekend hobby. But in medieval times, trapping was just life. No classes, no tutorials, just hemp string, a bit of dry grass, and a long enough hunger to invent a way to survive. On a winter morning, if you passed a village fence, you might see a tiny loop of cord hidden behind a twig. Please don't remove it. It might be a child's hope for lunch. And if you see an old man checking traps in the forest, don't ask, why doesn't he just buy food? Understand this. He's reconnecting with a time when every movement was a lesson in how to keep living. When the first cough of the season echoed through the thatched roof, noses began to sniffle, and throats stung after a night spent near a cold hearth. Medieval people didn't call a doctor. They went to the garden, the forest, or the nearest thicket. Long before orange pills and syrup that tasted like candy, humans survived on roots, bark, dried leaves, and a grandmother's intuition. A cold in the Middle Ages wasn't a joke. It could start with a sneeze, and if left untreated, turn into a fever, pneumonia, or even a one-way trip to the village cemetery. So, people took colds very seriously. The only difference was that their medicine didn't come in a bottle. It grew in the yard. Let's start with willow bark. Known as the aspirin of the old days, willow bark contains salicin, a natural pain reliever and fever reducer. Medieval folks knew this without a lab test. They scraped it thin, gently dried it, and brewed it into a tea so bitter it could make a cat grimace. But if you drank it, rested, and bundled up, the next morning, you might stand up without feeling like you were melting. Next came wild ginger root. Wild ginger was smaller, fiercer, and used as a throat antiseptic than the plump ginger we know today. A bite of raw ginger might make your eyes water, but it also kicked the cold out fast. People sucked on ginger, boiled it with porridge, or dried it for herbal sachets. Some even put it in their shoes, believing the heat from the soles would pull the illness downward and out. Strange? Maybe. But if you'd ever shivered through a snowstorm without a thick enough blanket, you'd try anything too. Then there's sage. It had a pungent smell and a slightly bitter taste. But when steeped into tea, it soothed sore throats and calmed lingering coughs. Sage was hung in kitchens and bedrooms, and even sewn into clothing. People believed its aroma drove away bad cold air, the invisible villain they blamed for sickness. Let's not forget nettles. Yes, the stingy, rash-causing plant. But once boiled into soup, it delivered vitamin C, iron, and calcium. Everything missing from a winter diet with no fresh produce. And if you're wondering, how did they know what worked? The answer? They observed. They watched animals nibble certain leaves when sick. They noticed who stopped coughing after drinking what. And above all, they passed it down. From grandmother to mother, mother to daughter. From the man coughing last week to the one sneezing today. Picture a winter night. A child curled near the fire. Mother boils water, drops in ginger slices, a pinch of willow bark, a handful of dried leaves, and whispers, "Drink this and lie down. Don't worry, you'll feel better by morning. No doctors, no prescriptions. Just a bitter bowl of tea, a glowing hearth, and care distilled from the roots of the earth." Sometimes the sick were steamed, not with essential oils, but with bundles of herbs boiled in pots. A towel over the head, a face over the vapor. Deep breaths. Sweat came, lungs cleared, throat softened, and that was the medieval version of a spa treatment. Today, when you cough, you open a medicine cabinet. But in the 14th century, you stepped into your backyard, and instead of picking the prettiest box, you picked the smallest root peeking from the soil. And if you survived winter with only ginger, dried leaves, and a lullaby, you did exactly what your ancestors did for centuries. You healed, not with what you bought, but with what you had. In the modern world, you just turn on the tap, grab some soap, and wash your hands for 20 seconds. Done. But even that idea would be a luxury if you lived through a winter in the 14th century. Because the water was frozen, and if it wasn't frozen, it was dirtier than your hands. Medieval people lived in a world where clean water wasn't readily available. Water was usable in summer, but in winter, wells iced over. Lakes became solid blocks. Scooping a few ladles could numb your hands so badly you couldn't even hold a spoon. So what did they do? They washed their hands without water. The first method, which may sound odd, was washing with ash. The leftover ashes weren't thrown away when the morning fire was lit. They were saved as a kind of natural soap. Ash has mild alkaline properties. It helped remove odors, grease, and bacteria to some extent. People would mix the ash with some water, if they had any, or sometimes just use it dry. You'd take a pinch of ash, rub it between your hands like the roughest facial scrub, and then dust it off. That's it. The feeling? Dry. Gritty. But clean. And most importantly, your hands wouldn't freeze. Besides ash, there was fine sand or dirt. You might be surprised to learn that people scrubbed their hands with earth, like we use exfoliating cloths today. Not everyone had soap made from sheep fat and boiled lye, but everyone had a handful of dry fireplace dirt. And if your hands were especially filthy, they added garlic. Yes. Crushed garlic wasn't just for flavoring soup. People believed it had strong antibacterial powers and could ward off bad air, a mix of folk medicine and a strong scent. Another common trick was the dry rag. Every home had a few pieces of cloth dedicated to wiping hands. It was not washed often, but was always hung by the hearth, kept dry and replaced regularly. After chores, baking, tending fires, milking, they'd wipe their hands on the rag, then casually dust them against a straw wall. Done. A complete hand-washing routine, medieval style. As for children, they often washed their hands by burrowing into their mother's sleeves, or not washing at all. Naturally, this alerted medieval mothers, sniffing, side-eyeing, and ready to yank up a tunic for a surprise wipe. People back then weren't obsessed with bacteria like we are. They didn't know about microbes, but they understood that clean hands meant fewer illnesses. It's just that their idea of clean wasn't kills 99.9% of germs, but no mud, no grease, and not too fishy. Importantly, medieval folks took hand wiping seriously during meals, even without wet towels. Before eating, everyone would rub their hands on linen, pant legs, or a nearby mud wall before eating. Because they ate with their hands. No individual spoons or forks. And dirty hands meant tainting the bread for everyone. In winter, the firekeeper would boil a few ladles in an iron pot if water had to be used. Then, pour it into a wooden basin for a quick dip, fast pull. No soaking, no scrubbing. Just the essentials: palms, fingertips, and backs of wrists. The rest, left to the fire to clean. Today we have hand gel, scented soaps, and endless hot water. Back then, our ancestors kept their hands clean with what they had: ash, dirt, garlic, and a bit of care. Not always fragrant, but clean enough to survive. And sometimes, just rubbing your hands together was enough to get back to chopping wood, tending the fire, or breaking bread with family. In a world without water filters, electric kettles, or any understanding of microbes, medieval people still had to do what we do every day: drink water. But they knew one crucial truth: not everything that looks like water is safe to put in your mouth. Picture this. It's a bitter winter day. The snow has just melted. Water is trickling down a muddy ditch. A cow just walked through it. A child washed clothes in it. And off in the distance, a duck is swimming, completely unbothered. You're thirsty, but you're not stupid. You know that water looks clean, but it'll send you to the grave faster than frostbite. So medieval people developed what we'd now call survival by common sense. First, they learned where to find water, still but not stagnant. Water was a top choice if the well was deep and rarely disturbed. Rainwater, caught from a clean roof, not a moldy wooden gutter, was good too. River water? Only if you collected it from upstream before it passed by the village, the livestock pens, or the cemetery. Sounds simple, but in practice, fetching one safe bucket of water requires knowledge of the land, the animals, and what your neighbors dumped in the ditch last week. Once you had the water, the next step was making it less dangerous. First, filtering. No fancy water filters. But there were coarse clothes, burlap sacks, and even old shirts. They'd tie fabric over the jug and pour slowly. Sure, it wouldn't kill bacteria, but at least it caught the sand, dead leaves, and swimming bugs. Then came settling. Water was left overnight in a clay jar, or wooden tub. The gunk settled to the bottom. By morning, the firekeeper would gently scoop from the top, like pouring fine wine. If they had enough firewood, they'd boil the water. Not everyone could. Wood was precious. Fires weren't easy to maintain. But if someone was sick, elderly, or very young, boiling was a matter of survival. Some families even kept a water schedule. Boil on windy days. Just filter when the firewood's damp. Some days, you filtered and hoped for the best. Another trick: steeping herbs in water. Mint, thyme, and dried orange peels didn't purify but masked the smell and drove away bad air. It didn't kill bacteria but made the water feel safer to drink. Children were the worst offenders. They'd sip from puddles, lick dirty ice, and eat snow straight from the ground. Adults had to scold constantly. Don't drink that. The color's wrong. No frogs in that water? Then it's poisoned. If the rain hasn't hit the gutter yet, drink it. If it has, the chickens drank first. In winter, water was even scarcer. Wells froze, streams dried. People smashed ice to collect water, then filtered it again. Sometimes, they boiled snow. But not everyone knew. Fresh snow is pure, but it drains your body heat as it melts. Drinking snow directly could make you dangerously cold, even sick. So, only melt snow if necessary. Otherwise, grit your teeth and pray for rain. One clever solution? Weak beer, not to get drunk, but because brewing required boiling. So if a house had a barrel of thin homebrew, people relaxed. At least the water had been cooked. Today, when you sip a clean, cold glass of water, remember that your ancestors once used torn shirts to strain water, caught rain off thatched roofs, boiled every ladle to feed a child. They took the first sip to ensure no one had to call the village healer that night. Not all water could be drunk, but those who knew which water to trust stood a better chance of surviving the winter. Because sometimes, survival isn't about brute strength. It's about knowing when to drink and when to turn away. Do you think winter is when the earth rests? Not wrong. But in the Middle Ages, if you waited until spring to plant, you'd be starving by December. That's why people back then had to learn how to grow vegetables in the dead of winter. No greenhouses, no heat lamps, just dirt, straw, ashes, and a quiet hope buried under the snow. It all began in August. As soon as the main harvest wrapped up, they began planning for the cold hardy season, a second round of planting with vegetables that could handle frost. At the top of the list was kale, the nearly immortal vegetable that got sweeter the colder it got. Next came purple cabbage, mustard greens, and wild onions that snuck up near the well. To protect the crops, they didn't use plastic coverings. They used straw. A thick layer was spread across the garden beds to hold warmth in the soil and keep snow from turning the ground rock solid. The gardener gently rakes the straw back each morning to let the greens breathe, then covers them again like tucking children under a wool blanket. In colder regions, people built root pits below ground level, covering them with, yes, a mixture of cow manure and straw. The natural heat from composting kept the air warm enough for kale to grow slowly without freezing. They also scattered ashes from the hearth around the base of plants. Ash helped insulate the roots, repel bugs, and added natural potassium to the soil. One older woman recalled that a single wild onion, grown atop kitchen ash, could survive 3 snowfalls in a row. Another nearly forgotten method? The live storage pit. Instead of harvesting all the turnips, carrots, or beets at once, they'd leave them in the ground, covering the topsoil with wooden boards and a thick straw layer. You simply lifted the cover when food was needed, like opening a natural fridge. No mold, no wilting. It's just a little cold, but sweet and firm when cooked. On the coldest days, some folks still crawled out to the garden at dawn, brushing aside straw to find a handful of leaves that hadn't wilted. Not to make a salad, but to add a hint of green to the plain porridge waiting over the fire. Not everyone had a winter garden, but everyone appreciated it. A bowl of steaming kale soup could warm frozen fingers. A hunk of stewed cabbage helped ease the constant winter constipation. And sometimes, just seeing a patch of green poking through gray soil was enough to remind you, spring isn't too far off. Winter gardens were also how children learned. Each morning, they'd fetch cooled ash water to water the plants. They'd pick bugs off by hand, scoop ash with wooden ladles, and watch each leaf grow like a quiet fairy tale coming to life. Today we eat vegetables from every season. In every season. But your ancestors once guarded every cabbage leaf like treasure. They didn't waste roots. They didn't pull too early. They lived with the soil, even when it froze, because they understood something vital. If you want to survive the winter, you have to start planting before the cold comes knocking. In the modern world, ash is trash, something to throw away before it dirties the house. But in the Middle Ages, ash wasn't just what was left behind after a fire. It was a tool, an ingredient, a quiet part of survival strategy. People then wasted nothing, especially fireplace ash, the precious byproduct of daily fire-making. From the yard to the kitchen, to the garden, and even to hygiene, ash was like a silent friend, always helpful. First, ash was used for cleaning. With no chemical soap, medieval folk mixed ash with water to wash dishes, scrub hands, scour pots, and even make handmade soap. Ash dissolved in water created a mild alkaline solution, strong enough to cut grease, yet gentle enough to use with bare hands. A bit of ash sprinkled on a chopping board after gutting fish. Odor gone. A handful mixed with sand to scrub soot from iron pots. Back to shine like new. And if you've ever cooked on a wood fire, you'll understand why ash was also used to smother embers, keep things sanitary, or quickly rub off a burned palm. Next, ash was a deodorizer. In places without proper toilets, waste pits were covered with ash after each use, the only way to keep the smell somewhat under control. In kitchens, ash was scattered near meat to keep flies away. A bit of ash on the floor kept ants and bugs at bay in bedrooms. And when someone fell ill, ash might be placed in a corner, believed to absorb bad air, according to ancient beliefs. No one knew what ash absorbed, but people believed in it. And sometimes, belief alone lets you sleep easier. Ash also had a place in the garden, a big one. Wood ash is rich in potassium, a nutrient plants love, especially in cold weather. It was sprinkled on kale beds, mixed into onion roots, or spread around garlic patches to keep the soil from turning too acidic. The result? Faster growing veggies, fewer pests, and stronger resistance to frost. No chemicals, no industrial fertilizer, just ash, from the same fire you started that morning. But ash had even more surprising uses, like preserving food. Believe it or not, potatoes rolled in ash and buried in a cellar could last months without rotting. Salted meat or fish was dusted with a thin layer of ash to keep flies away. And seeds for next season? Often stored mixed with dry ash to prevent moisture and mold. Ash even served as a temperature gauge for the hearth. An older woman once said, "Lots of ash means the fire's content. Little ash? The stove is hungry." The firekeeper only needed to glance at the ash color to know if today's wood burned well, whether to add thicker logs or if there'd be enough embers to keep the porridge warm through the night. Ash also had its place in folk medicine. Bitten by a bug? Sprinkle dry ash on it. Stomachache? Mix sifted ash into water, strain carefully and sip. Not everyone trusted it, but when you had no medicine, you used what you had. Even in brushing teeth, ash played a role. People mixed the ash with salt and used it to scrub their teeth. It didn't give a sparkling white smile, but kept bad breath from ruining the morning. And then, ash became a symbol. Where there was ash, there was a hearth. Where there was a hearth, there was fire. And where there was fire, there was life. Ash is the last breath of a flame, but the beginning of so many things. A new batch of bread, a thriving vegetable patch, a sealed, draft-free wall, and a winter day that didn't feel quite so bitter. Today, we call ash a mess, but your ancestors once used it to clean, feed, protect, and even cook up hope. So, if you're listening to this story in a warm room tonight, remember, it was ash, falling silently as fires died down, that once served as an unsung hero in the battle against winter. Nighttime in the Middle Ages was nothing like it is today. There were no streetlights, security cameras, or roar of motorbikes in the distance. Just the wind slipping through thatched roofs, the hoot of an owl far away, and occasionally, the sound of unfamiliar footsteps crunching across the frozen ground. In a world where the only thing separating villager from stranger was a dry stick fence, medieval people devised a straightforward way to tell friends from foe. No printed passwords, no ID cards, just the sound of a knock. Not everyone got to knock 3 times and wait. Every home and every family in the village had their knock, passed down by word of mouth, learned from childhood, and never mistaken. Some houses had 2 quick taps followed by 1 slow one. Others, 3 steady knocks and a soft hiss, like someone clearing their throat. It might sound random, but to those inside, it was more accurate than calling a name. The people in the house were trained to listen. They didn't need to peek through a crack in the door. Just by the knock, they knew. Father's home late from the market. Grandmother has come with a sack of dry cakes. A cousin wants to borrow a hammer. But if the knock was unfamiliar, silence. No reply. No candle lit. Sometimes, one wrong rhythm was enough to make a whole family hold their breath till dawn. The doors didn't have locks, just a wooden bar across the inside, or maybe a rope looped through a latch. But what kept the house safe wasn't stone walls or metal bolts. It was the careful ears of those inside. And in winter, this mattered more than ever. Thieves were rare in summer. People could chase them then. But in winter, when everyone was curled under blankets, when wood was scarce and bread was tight, a starving man might risk entering a village for just a few potatoes or a chunk of rye bread. So each night, the grown-ups took turns, listening to the wind and to the knock. Even the entrances to villages had their secret signals. Many villages had a wooden gate or a narrow main path. Night watchmen, usually wise older men or unmarried young ones, took turns sleeping in small huts by the gate, listening. When footsteps came in the dark, they didn't shout out questions. They listened to how the stranger tapped their walking stick on the ground. 1 tap, 2 taps, a pause, then 3 quick ones. If the rhythm matched, the guard stayed still. If not, he stood, grabbed his staff, and called into the night, "Name, what business?" If no answer came, that stranger didn't step into the village. Some places even had seasonal codes. In winter, when thefts increased, families changed their knock patterns. A friendly neighbor might whisper, "This season it's 2 quick, 1 heavy. Don't mess it up." And if someone wasn't told, maybe they weren't trusted anymore. Children learned early. Know the person by the knock. Sometimes at dinner, parents made a game of it. Papa knocks 3 times. Who is it? The kids loved it. But later, they understood. This was no game. It was how you protected your home. There were nights of strong wind when the kitchen fire was down to its final glow. A mother held her child close and turned toward the door. Outside, there was a knock. 1, 2, 3. Pause. 1, 1. Long. Silence. It's not the right rhythm, not someone familiar. She held her baby tighter and gripped the wooden bar across the door. And in her mind, if you don't knock right, please, walk away. Then the next morning, her husband returned, knocking the familiar rhythm. 3 even taps, then 1 slow. The door opened instantly, and in her eyes, there was more than joy. There was confirmation. He was still one of those meant to be inside. Today, we have smart doorbells, infrared cameras, and 6-digit codes. Back then, all they had were ears and trust. The right knock at the right time brought peace. The wrong one brought silence as cold as the walls. A knock became the only thing standing between a quiet supper and a night of fear in the long winters. And sometimes, that simple rhythm, a knock done right, was all it took to keep life safely burning behind a wooden door. Not everyone had enough firewood in the medieval winter to keep a fire burning all day. Wood was gold, hard-earned, hand-split from deep in the forest, and never wasted. So people devised a simple, clever way to keep warm: trap the wind. Not to catch it, but to block it. Right at the door. Wind was the invisible enemy of every cold season home. It didn't knock nor howl. It slipped silently through every crack in the wall, floorboard seam, and especially under the door. One night of northern wind, and even with a fire, the family could shiver like they were sleeping in an open field. So, medieval villagers invented wind traps, using one humble material: fabric. Not pretty fabric, just thick, old, long enough cloth. A worn-out wool scarf, a torn cloak, or a cut-up grain sack could become a winter shield. At the door, it started with the simplest trick: a draft snake. Take a strip of cloth, stuff it with straw, roll it into a thick eel, and wedge it snug against the door before bed. Some households stitched 2 tubes together, filled with stuffing, and looped them across both sides of the door, so every time the door closed, the wind was blocked automatically. Windows, or small circular holes covered with wooden flaps, were lined with thick fabric on the inside, not for decoration, but to muffle the wind's whistle and trap any lingering warmth. One layer of cloth wouldn't stop the winter, but it kept the fire's heat from slipping out, enough to stay the night bearable. The wind was hunted down like a thief in the kitchen, the home's beating heart. Thick cloths hung behind chairs, small rugs were placed underfoot, and warm rags covered the fire's last embers, keeping the warmth from being stolen by the morning chill. Children had their nightcoats, thick scarves wrapped around their bellies and hips, tied with twine to hold in the heat. Mothers even lined straw beds with old fabric so that if the little ones kicked off their blankets, they'd still be surrounded by warmth traps. The crafty ones made full-blown wind curtains, not silk, but patchworked layers of cloth, hung behind doors or between rooms. When a gust blew through the kitchen, those curtains kept the cold from invading the sleeping quarters. In some homes, a ragged blanket was hung across the rafters, creating a ceiling barrier to catch drafts or dripping dew from the thatched roof. In colder regions, families stretched animal hides along the walls, not as trophies, but to stop the warmth from being sucked into freezing mud brick. In a world without insulation foam, cement, or double-pane glass, people used what they had: old clothes and patience. And if a piece of fabric tore, they didn't throw it out. They patched, stitched, and used it for 2 more winters. Over time, these pieces of cloth absorbed everything: the smell of wood smoke, the seasons, the people. Some families kept a specific cloth passed down from a mother, hung by the drafty door for 20 years, like a quiet blessing fluttering in the cold. Today, we press a button, and the heater hums to life. But imagine a night with no power, no firewood, just a few worn pieces of cloth. You'd find that a bundled scarf under the door, a coat tied around your calves, and a wool blanket nailed over a window might just be enough to survive the dark. Keeping warm doesn't always mean burning more. Sometimes it just means knowing where the wind sneaks in, and being clever enough to tell it, "Not tonight." If you lived in the 14th century and winter had begun to blow its icy breath through every crack in your mud walls, you wouldn't wish for a fashionable coat or some expensive wool from a city market. You'd be wishing for a thick animal hide, fur and all. In a world where the cold showed no mercy, fur was the armor of people with low incomes. And nothing kept warmth better than the coat that once helped a creature survive the snowy forest. Of course, not everyone could afford a nobleman's fox fur cloak, but ordinary folk knew how to use anything they caught, from hares and fat field rats to squirrels, martens, and even an old sheep that died of age. A man who snared 2 large rabbits wouldn't eat all the meat. The part would be smoked over the hearth, and the rest, skinned. That pelt wasn't tossed away. It was cleaned, stretched, and dried on a thatched roof. Once cured, it was soft, and still held a faint memory of the warmth it once kept. From just a few pelts, people stitched together cloaks, hoods, or inner linings for tunics. The sewing didn't need to be beautiful. It just had to be sturdy, no wind slipping through the seams. In some places, fur-lined gloves were made. Leather outside, fur turned in. No matter how bitter the cold, slipping your hands in felt like plunging them into the belly of a still-living rabbit. Children were wrapped in sheep wool blankets. Not the soft fleece we know today, but whole animal hides, thick and coarse, that made them sweat within 5 minutes of being covered. Elderly folks used old cowhide, heavy, stiff, but windproof and warm enough to sleep on without freezing from the ground up. In some homes, squirrel skin was used to line shoes. When stepping onto the frozen stone, that fur pressed close to the soles and kept warmth in every toe. People even lined the walls of their homes with coarse hides. Fox skins by the hearth, goat hides behind the door, bear cub pelts nailed up to stop the wind, all quietly whispering, "We're still alive." Fur was stuffed into pillows, wedged behind chairs, and especially wrapped around newborns' necks. It was believed that babies sleeping in a fur bed cough less, catch fewer colds, and cry far less. Some mothers even stitched fur pouches, the medieval version of a sleeping bag, where the baby was tucked in at night and the drawstring pulled tight like a winter-wrapped rice cake. Nothing went to waste. Bones, boiled into soup. Meat, smoked or roasted. Hide, kept out the cold. Fur, helped a family survive in sunny months. One dead animal could help one person live another month, and to a medieval peasant, that was a blessing. Fur was also how you could tell the forest folk from those inside the village. A man with a marten scarf? They likely just returned from the hunt. An older woman with a patchy sheepskin coat? She's seen more winters than you've had birthdays. As someone once said, fur isn't just warmth, it's memory. Every strand tells the story of a winter already endured. Today, we wear synthetic insulation, triple-layer jackets, and waterproof boots. But in the darkness of a world without electricity, heating, and fancy gear, a single animal hide was the line between living and not. It didn't have to look good. Just stay warm. It didn't need to be new. Just thick enough to stop the wind. And if, one night, you're curled beneath a thick blanket listening to the wind howl outside, remember, someone once clung to a rabbit skin, buried their face in bare fur, and whispered thanks to the creature that gave them one more season to survive. Not everyone liked sleeping together, unless the cold forced you to. In the Middle Ages, where the fire didn't always burn, and beds were a luxury, warmth was shared as a survival strategy. You'd lie next to Grandma. The youngest child is tucked in between, a drowsy hen snoozing near your feet. And in the most honored spot, given prime position on freezing winter nights, was the dog. Yes, you heard right. Not the baby. Not the frail grandfather. The dog. Because in every instinctual and practical survival study, dogs were the original breathing heaters. With a higher body temperature than humans, loyal by nature, and willing to lie still through the night if treated kindly, or if you shared a corner of your bread before bed. The nobles were different. They had stone fireplaces, bed curtains, and carpets so thick you could get lost in them. But even among the elite, shared warmth was a silent custom. Between handmaidens, squires, and sometimes two strangers stuck at the same roadside inn during a pilgrimage. One kept the warmth, the other kept quiet. A contract never spoken, but always understood. In the countryside, where the wind slipped through every gap like it had a ticket to the show, every warm option was explored. Some families lined the walls with straw, spread out animal hides, and slept huddled like storm-sheltering sparrows. Children were wedged between adults to conserve heat, and the adults rotated spots each night, so one side of the body didn't freeze too long. In some villages, communal sleeping was practically a social ritual. Winter guests weren't invited to stay just out of hospitality, but because the host needed one more warm body to help heat the room. You were a welcome guest? Great. You were also a free heater. Sleeping together wasn't just for comfort. It was how you prevented illness, saved firewood, and kept the fire in your chest, literal and figurative, from going out. A touch of the hand, a steady breath, a soft snore could all be quiet messages. We're still here. Of course, there were limits. The very rich, or the overly draft-sensitive, might sleep alone under thick furs with a ceramic pot of glowing coals. But even they, on a bone-deep cold night, even they would admit that nothing warms like another trembling body beside you. Some say sleeping together was a wordless form of intimacy. In a time without heaters, soundproof walls, or any warming device beyond shared breath, your existence was tethered to the presence of others. And in those long, clockless nights, filled only with steady breathing, the crackle of burning wood, and occasionally the low grumble of a hungry belly, that closeness was the only thing keeping you tethered to what winter tried hardest to take. The sense that you belonged somewhere, that you were still part of someone. So whether you were a noble or a peasant, sleeping on carved wood or hard-packed straw, the lesson remained. When the cold came, you wouldn't choose privacy. You'd choose survival. And that, more than any style, was the true definition of warmth in the medieval world. Do you think you're thrifty for reusing plastic bags as trash liners? Try living in the Middle Ages, where the concept of throwing something away simply didn't exist. Everything had at least 2 lives, sometimes 3. And if you tossed something too soon, someone else would surely pick it up and turn it into something you'd never imagine. Old clothes? Don't even think about giving them away or letting them sit unused. If they were too short to wear, they were cut into leg wraps. Strips of cloth wrapped around the shins to keep warm and protect your only pair of pants from mud. If they were too ragged, even for that, they were torn smaller still to make hand towels, kitchen rags, or ties to secure the roof on windy days. Eggshells? A favorite ingredient of local healers, people dried them, crushed them into fine powder, and mix them with vinegar or boiled mugwort water to treat stomach pain or increase the odds of having a baby boy if you believed your neighbor. No promises, but at least you weren't tossing them into the dung heap. Sheep dung? No joke. If you lived in northern England, where winter winds blew straight through stone, dried sheep droppings made excellent insulation. Mixed with clay and straw, it was used to seal walls, plug gaps, or patch the roof. When burned, it doubled as fuel, pungent, unpleasant, but more reliable than damp firewood. And fish bones? Do you think they were tossed out back? Think again. If needed, dried fish heads could be boiled for a second, third, or 10th broth. And when they lost all flavor, they were hung in windows to ward off flies. Believe it or not, rural cottages often displayed fish heads as makeshift bug repellent, or as a subtle warning to neighbors not to come asking for another favor. Even vegetable rinse water wasn't wasted. After washing turnips or kale, the cloudy water was poured into buckets, then used to water plants, splash into latrines, or boiled again and added to soup on days when the pantry held only salt and hope. Every item in a medieval peasant's home lived a long, winding, and often strange life. A chipped bowl wasn't thrown out. It was patched with tree resin, wrapped in twine, and turned into a cat dish. An old rope? Unwound thread by thread, repurposed to bundle firewood or tied around sleeves to keep them from dragging in the fire. Even shed hair was collected, not for anything glamorous, but some believed it made a decent winter filler inside padded clothing. It was supposedly better at trapping heat than straw, and less itchy. Lost teeth? Sometimes carried in leather pouches as lucky charms. Scraps of fabric, splinters of wood, dry leaves, fingernail clippings, shed animal fur. All had a place in something new, useful, or at least not entirely useless. Medieval people didn't call it recycling. They called it living. When winter could stretch for half a year and crop failure wasn't a possibility, but a reality, frugality wasn't a virtue. It was a survival instinct. So every item in your home, from a cracked jug to a worn-out length of twine to a pair of socks darned for the 8th time, carried a story. It has a history of reuse, adaptation, and being wrung dry of every possible use until it simply couldn't be used anymore. Because in a world where the cold was merciless, hunger had no pity, and death waited just outside the door, waste was a sin worse than any church curse. There's nothing crueler than a hungry stomach in the dead of winter, except knowing there's nothing left to eat. And in your little medieval village, the food stores have dwindled to a few wilted onions, some turnips hard as stone, and a jar of salt so damp it needs to be smashed open. Dinner is no longer about what to eat. It's about how to convince your stomach that it just ate something. And this is where the nose takes over. Medieval people learned to smell like they were eating when eating wasn't an option. Dried herbs, orange peels, bay leaves, and rosemary sprigs weren't just seasonings. They were spiritual therapy, an olfactory feast for the starving mind. A pot hung over the fire, filled with nothing but water and a few fragrant leaves, could make the entire home smell like an authentic meal. And sometimes, that was enough. Some would roast dried citrus peels over hot coals, letting the sweet aroma drift through the room like a lullaby for the belly. Others crushed peppercorns, mixed them into warm water, and sipped slowly as if enjoying a gourmet broth. Your mother, who once turned a single onion into dinner for 5, might boil basil leaves with a splash of vinegar, then place the pot in the center of the house. Everyone would sit around it, breathing deeply as if preparing for a feast. No one was truly full, but everyone felt a little better. And in these times, a little better could mean the difference between sleeping soundly or curling up with a growling stomach until dawn. Wise housewives even learned to trick the tongue with pretend food. A stale hunk of bread, soft as a dishcloth, could be rubbed with garlic or dipped in herbal water and toasted. Not enough to call a meal, but enough to keep the mouth busy. A piece of dried root dipped in watery honey might be sucked on all evening like a rare sweet, even if it crunched like bark and tasted only of patience. Anise seeds, fennel, dried chamomile. These were stored like treasure, not for fancy dishes, but to steep in hot water, creating a fragrant tea that masked your meal that night was just plain porridge with a pinch of hope. Sometimes your father would head out to the fields with a sprig of dried thyme tucked into his collar, not to eat, but so that when the wind blew, the scent might tickle his nose and calm his growling stomach. Others tucked sage under their pillows, believing, if you sleep with a sweet smell, you'll dream of being full. No one knew if it worked, but in a long winter, people learned to believe in anything that brought a smile. The nobles, of course, were different. They had spice chests from the east, cinnamon, cloves, ginger, nutmeg. They sprinkled these on everything, not just for flavor but to flaunt their wealth. But peasants had their methods, less flashy but no less clever. A pinch of dried herbs on roasted turnip could turn last season's scraps into this winter's special. All thanks to something you can't even see: scent. And in those hungry nights, you learn something vital. Eating isn't just done with the mouth. It's imagined with the mind. A smell can fill the void, like a thin blanket covering the cold. Not enough to forget, but sufficient to endure. When you grow up, you'll remember those dinners. Not because they were delicious, but because they proved that even in hunger, people found ways to be creative, to comfort themselves, and to pretend with surprising elegance. And sometimes, that's how you survive. You thought you were afraid of sleeping on the ground, but that's only because you've never slept on the ground. In a remote medieval village, when winter blanketed the hills, and frost crept through every crack in the wall, there was a strange but surprisingly effective kind of bedroom, the hole. Not a grave, and indeed not a fancy shelter, just a shallow pit dug beneath the floor, carved out by shovel, hand, or spoon. Just wide enough for two people to lie side by side, half a body deep, and as warm as Mother Nature's embrace, if your mother smelled like damp earth and mildew. Medieval folks didn't have thermometers, but they had something better: skin. And after enough frozen winters, they figured out that the air beneath the ground was always warmer than the air above, especially when the wind howled through the thatched roof like it was chasing your soul. So they dug when beds lacked blankets, homes lacked hearths, and firewood was a luxury. The pit didn't need to be large, just low enough to duck under the icy air skimming the floor, deep enough to borrow the stable temperature of the earth. Some families padded the bottom with straw, spread a coarse mat over it, and placed a large flat stone at one end as a pillow. It wasn't comfortable, but it kept you from freezing. Some families even dug sleeping nooks inside the animal pens, not because they'd run out of space, but because that's where the pigs were. The smell was awful, but the warmth of a full-grown hog could save your toes from frostbite. There was even a saying, possibly half-joking: to survive the winter, love your pig more than your husband. In harsher climates, they built full earth rooms, half-buried huts, roofed with straw, walled with packed mud. When winter came, the whole family moved in. No lights, no windows, no privacy, but warm. And in those times, warm was priceless. Of course, sleeping underground had its downsides: mildew, bugs, and an indescribable smell. Part feet, part old straw, part damp soil. But lying there, half buried in the hay, head on a stone, besides your snoring sibling puffing like a blacksmith's bellows, you'd realize one simple truth. Warm is enough. Not fancy, not fragrant, not Instagrammable. Time slowed inside the hole. No wind, no moonlight. Just breathe. Heartbeats. And a primal sensation. As if you were sleeping inside the womb again, where the earth cradles you without asking for anything but stillness and patience. Children who grew up in sleeping pits would later say it was the time they hated most, and missed the most. 'Cause in that bone-deep cold, the whole family curled up like a nest of hibernating cats. No extra space, no extra words. Just existence, close, honest, and raw as breath itself. You once thought a home meant four walls. But sometimes all it takes is a hole, deep enough to block the wind, wide enough to hold each other, and warm enough to fall asleep without fearing frostbitten toes at sunrise. Sleeping on the ground wasn't glamorous, it wasn't romantic, but it was how people with nothing but earth, sky, and each other saved themselves. And maybe, just maybe, that's all it takes to call something home. You might not believe it, but on a winter night in a medieval peasant's home, your feet were the center of the universe. Because when your feet go cold, your heart begins to tremble. And when your toes go numb, the next thing you might lose is your toes themselves. So, foot soaking wasn't for relaxation. It was a survival ritual. There was no ready hot water, no fancy wooden tubs, just a bit of ash, the remnants from a long day of tending the hearth, carefully scooped from the bottom of the stove and poured into a chipped clay basin. You'd add water and hear a faint hiss, soft like breathing. Ash and water formed a lukewarm, cloudy mixture, warm enough to keep you from screaming in pain. You'd sit on the edge of a straw bed, roll up pants stiff with mud and wind, and lower your feet. The first sensation was a sting, like every nerve ending waking from a frozen coma. Then came the numbness. Then, peace. Ash retained heat for a long time. It wasn't scalding like fire, nor cool as fast as plain water. It lingered, like a whisper, like someone's patient hand holding you gently. Your toes slowly blushed pink again, feeling returned. And most importantly, so did the belief that you wouldn't need to amputate come spring. Adults used ash. Children reused and reheated old ash by pouring boiling water from the porridge pot. Every night, the family took turns soaking. Mother went first, then grandmother. Father waited until everyone was done, dipping his feet into whatever remained, just enough to keep his big toe from turning purple. In some places, they mixed ash with dried herbs, usually mugwort or mint, to chase the cold from the bones. No one knew if it worked, but the scent in your nose made the soul feel lighter. Some dipped the cloth in warm ash water to wrap wrists and knees, a kind of instinctive physical therapy. No books, just wisdom passed from grandmother to mother. In colder regions, people smeared ash directly on their feet, mixed it with pig fat, wrapped it in scraps, and stuffed it into straw shoes. You walked to the fields with feet that sizzled like roasted yams. It sounds ridiculous, but it saved you from frostbite, the kind that cracked open and festered, and no one in your village knew how to stitch blood with anything other than banana leaves and prayers. Each night before bed, the scent of ash would mix with hearth smoke, old straw blankets, and your family's scent. A wild blend that's hard to describe, but so familiar you couldn't fall asleep without it. And at that moment, when your feet stopped shivering, when warmth crept slowly back into your skin, you'd know. You'd won the night against the cold, at least this time. Soaking your feet wasn't a luxury. It was a quiet promise to your body. I know you're tired. I don't have much, but I will keep you warm, whatever it takes. And sometimes, all it took was a basin of warm ash, a little patience, and a pair of toes that didn't turn blue. to know you were still alive. Suppose you think singing is a luxury reserved for royal banquets or monastery choirs. In that case, you've never shivered inside a thatched hut on a medieval winter night, with cold creeping into your fingernails, and your last thought before sleep is, will I even wake up tomorrow? In times like that, singing isn't joy, it's strategy. On freezing nights, when the fire has dwindled to embers, your grandmother begins to hum. A song you've heard since before you knew how to wash your hands. The melody is steady and straightforward, with no climax or flourish. But how she sings, soft and sure, makes you feel warm. Not because her voice gives off heat, but because it calms your heartbeat. And when your heart beats steadily, blood flows. When blood flows, your toes don't turn purple. You don't need to know the lyrics. You just join in. Then, the whole family joins. Everyone takes a line. Your little sibling sings out of rhythm, and your mother's voice is so soft you can only see her lips move. But no one minds, because winter singing isn't about sounding good. It's about staying alive. The best part? Singing does make you warmer. Modern science might explain it as increased heart rate, improved circulation, elevated mood. Medieval folks knew that your face tingled less after a song or two, and your worry eased. Adults used songs to warm the room. Children sang to forget their hunger. The tired, the aching, the frostbitten, after a long day clearing snow from the roof, found that singing, even through chattering teeth, lit a small fire somewhere inside the chest. Some songs had no words, just drawn-out tones drifting from the throat like musical breath. Some were passed down for generations like chants laying a path for winter to pass. Others were silly, cheeky, and barely made sense, but made the children giggle, warming the air a few degrees more. In gatherings, singing became a ritual. No instruments, no drums, just hands clapping, spoons tapping pots, feet stomping the packed earth floor. Every village had its melodies. Some sang lullabies that echoed like wind through hedgerows. Others sang in call and response, one voice leading, the rest chasing it like children playing tag with sound. There were even warming songs, belted loudly when hauling firewood, herding sheep into barns, or trudging through snow to visit neighbors. These songs didn't just get your body moving. They chased away the loneliness of walking across a white, silent world. Some verses were satire. So cold even the mice left their nest. Or, my fingers have turned to frozen turnips. Lines that made the whole village laugh. A medicine stronger than any hot soup. The nobility sang too, but in warm halls, with lutes and velvet gowns. Peasants sang to keep their blood moving, to push back against the cold, threatening to steal their voices, breath, and spirit. Each song was an invisible blanket for them, wrapping the rickety house and keeping it from trembling in the wind. And if you think, what can sing possibly change? Imagine a winter night that stretches endlessly, the fire dim, your body shaking too hard to sleep. Then, someone hums an old tune. Then, another voice joins. Then yours. None of you are full. None of you are dressed warmly. But in that moment, you feel, deeply, inexplicably, that you're not alone. And somehow, with just one song, winter becomes bearable, warmer, survivable. Frostbite doesn't send a warning. In the morning, it's just a tingle. By afternoon, it's burning red. Come nightfall, your hands are swollen and itchy, and they sting like ants biting from the inside out. In the Middle Ages, when everything was cold except the fire, and the fire was never enough for everyone, people came up with a simple, crude, and strangely effective remedy. Fat, not lotion. There was no such thing as winter moisturizer in a peasant's kitchen. They had pig fat, flaxseed oil, or, if luck allowed, a bit of butter churned from thick sour milk. These were stored in clay pots, kept near the hearth so they wouldn't solidify. And every morning, before heading to the fields, you'd see your mother, hands cracked like dry earth, scoop out a lump of grease and rub it into her palms and fingers, like preparing for battle. The smell? Awful, heavy, greasy, with a faint tang of the animal that died 3 months ago. But when the cold was so harsh that even the sunrise brought no warmth, that smell became the scent of survival. The fat didn't just moisturize, it formed a barrier. A greasy, sticky layer that wind couldn't penetrate. It clung to the skin like a stubborn hope, shielding flesh from winter's cruel bite. Anyone who forgot to grease their hands in the morning would regret it by dusk, fingers aching like tiny blades were slicing under the skin. Blacksmiths mixed pig fat with ash and rubbed it into their wrists, to warm the joints and ease the hammer's sting. Cart pullers greased their elbows where the wind slipped through sleeves. Children, always running, never cautious, had fat rubbed into their hands each night as part of the bedtime ritual. Smear, wrap in cloth, massage, then tuck under the blanket like tiny greasy burritos. Some regions mixed the fat with herbs, mugwort, beeswax, or mustard seed, to make warming salves. The recipes were passed down by word of mouth. No one remembered where they came from. All that mattered was every household had a small jar by the fire, used for hands, heels, headaches, and, occasionally, weary hearts. Nobles had fancier options: perfumed oils, imported herbal waxes, and warm rosewater balms. But even a specific count, after getting frostbite on a snowbound hunt, had to follow his old wet nurse's advice: smear pig fat on his hands and stuff them into a sack of straw. 3 days later, he was cured. It might sound ridiculous, but in a world where even your smile could freeze, ridiculous was acceptable, as long as it worked. Some even swore the fat saved their spirit. That rubbing your hands every morning without fail was a promise to yourself. I won't let you fall off one finger at a time. A rough sort of tenderness, but real. And so, you learn to survive. Dip your hands into the jar each morning. Rub every finger well. Take a deep breath of grease, of smoke, of this whole stubborn winter. Then, step outside into the wind. Your hands are still sticky, but your heart? It's a little warmer. Because sometimes, to make it through winter, you don't need a miracle. Just a jar of fat, a hand that cares for itself. And the belief that as long as you can still feel, there's still hope. Winter nights in your village are always cold. But a night without fire, that's not just cold, that's dangerous. The unforgiving chill seeps through the thatched walls, creeping up from the damp earth beneath the straw, and fills the silence so thoroughly that even the mice go still. And there you are, sitting beside a dead hearth, gripping a flintstone and a dull piece of iron, knowing you have one more shot at hope, before your whole family shivers their way into the morning. The fire went out. Maybe the wood ran out. Maybe the wind blew too strong. Or maybe you just fell asleep while tending the ashes. In the Middle Ages, no matches, lighters, or such a quick flick. When the fire died, you didn't relight it. You summoned it back. And for that, you needed flint. The stone rolls around in the bottom of the cupboard beside a little pouch of char cloth. Scraps of old shirts sang just enough to catch a spark. The steel striker is rusty and worn, but everyone in the village knows, if it can make a spark, there is still hope. You press the stone into your palm, steady. Place the char cloth at the edge, then raise the steel, and strike. Not hard. but at the right angle, the right rhythm. You strike like you're knocking on the door of a haunted house, cautious but resolute. Once, nothing. Again, a tiny spark, then gone. You stay calm, rushing only tears skin, and pain is useless right now. After a few minutes, a faint glow flickers at the edge of the cloth. You don't blow hard, never. You breathe into it, softly, like whispering to a newborn. Warm breath, even, gentle. The ember glows brighter, from red to orange. You nestle it into your waiting bundle of straw, dry, loose, eager. And when the first small flame flutters to life, no one cheers. You simply exhale, like you've just tugged light back from the edge of the dark. This fire starting isn't something everyone knows. Only a few elders still remember how to choose the right flint and how to keep the char cloth from getting damp. Some guard the skill like a treasure, whispered to a child on a deathbed. Others share it freely, believing fire belongs to no one. In noble houses, fires burn all night. Servants tend the hearth. Embers are kept alive like sacred relics. But in the countryside, you must know how to call it back if you can't keep the fire. No one will knock at midnight to help you. No one's coming with light. It's just you. The flint, the steel, the straw, and the skill you learned the first time the fire died, when you were just a child and old enough to fear the dark. Once, you cried when you couldn't make a spark. Your hands blistered, your face smeared in ash. But then, your great-grandmother, so old no one remembered her real name, placed a hand on your shoulder and said, "Fire doesn't like fear. It comes to the patient." Since then, you don't say you're making a fire every time you strike a flint. You say you're inviting it back, like a ritual, like a quiet conversation between you and the most fragile, most necessary light in the world. Because in this time, fire is everything. It is food. It is warmth. It's the place where hands dry, where clothes lose their frost, where hope thaws out after a day too cold, too tired, too long. And sometimes, all you need to survive the night is a scrap of cloth, a single clean spark, and a faith that never dies. Just like the fire, hidden in the ash, waiting to be called home. No gloves, no wool. No stores open in winter where you can stop by for something warm. But there is grass, the kind that grows wild in the fields, now shriveled and stiff from autumn's end. The kind everyone thinks is only suitable for lining chicken coops, patching roofs, or feeding cows is too dull to care for. But in the Middle Ages, dry grass, in the hands of the desperate and the clever, was all in, and perhaps the clearest symbol of the stubborn creativity of people who refuse to let the cold win. No one thinks grass can be woven, but if you work with it long enough, you'll understand that dry grass softens near heat, twisted into cords, and it holds better than you'd expect. No one called it weaving in the elegant sense. There were no looms, no crochet hooks, just clumps of grass, twisted and pressed between scraps of old cloth, wrapped around hands and tied with flax string. Ugly, bulky, but warm. Your mother made your first pair the year snow piled over the roof. You were 5. Your fingers are purple, your thumb frozen stiff. She sat by the hearth, gathered dry grass from behind the pigsty, pulled out the softest strands, gently pounded them, passed them through the fire's warmth, and wrapped your hands like an unfinished gift. And strangely, within minutes, you felt alive again. The grass smelled earthy, slightly damp, but it held heat like a charm. From that winter on, the first thing your family gathered wasn't firewood. It was grass. Not just any kind. It had to be evenly dried, not moldy, not brittle. It was hung in bundles above the kitchen hearth, catching smoke, drying more, and keeping bugs away. Children were tasked with tearing and sorting which strands made good mattress stuffing strong enough to become mittens. Grass mitts were nothing like genuine gloves. No stretch, no style, no water resistance. But they formed a thick barrier between your skin and the cold that sliced like a blade. In the fields, gripping a frozen hoe, you'd thank those clumsy little bundles of hay wrapped around your hands, because without them, you wouldn't feel your fingers. The elders stuffed grass inside their sleeves and lined their collars. Children played games. Who could roll the fastest? Who made the softest pouch? Some twisted the grass into little animals, tied them to walking sticks, and called them warmth charms. Did they work? No one knew. But they made the snow-white mornings feel less heavy. Sometimes you'd see someone in the village with a pair of grass mittens, wrapped in an old fabric pouch, like two small hay bales tied to their wrists. And you knew. Inside, they were warm. And this winter, warmth is wealth. The nobles laughed. They had furs, velvet. Lambskin gloves are sewn with silk thread. But if they got lost in your village on a freezing night, no firewood, no servants, no carriage, you knew they'd do the same. Break the grass, stuff their palms, and breathe on their fingers like a prayer. Because in a world with nothing but nature and persistence, everything can become a survival tool. Even something as fragile as grass. If you sit down, twist it into shape, and place it just right, can become armor between you and the silent killer called frost. And when winter finally passes, you'll toss your worn grass mitts behind the stove and think, next year, start sooner, gather more, because no one knows how cold next year will be. But you do know one thing: if it's between nothing and a handful of dry grass, you'll choose the grass, and you'll survive. When you think of sleeping in winter, you might imagine a soft, thick pillow, warm as a mother's embrace. But that dream was just that. A dream in the Middle Ages. Goose-down pillows, cotton stuffing, anything remotely soft was a luxury for the rich. As for you, you laid your head on wood. It sounds like punishment. But in reality, it was a survival hack. This pillow wasn't a pillow. It was a block of wood, sometimes square, sometimes round, just a chopped log with its edges shaved down. It was angled beneath your neck so your head didn't tip backward. No one expected it to be comfortable. But anyone who used one would tell you that it was warm. Or at least it didn't steal warmth, especially from the nape of your neck, where the blood runs close to the skin and cold always strikes first when you start to doze off. Medieval people believed warming the head and neck was the top priority on winter nights. Cold feet could be endured. An empty belly could be tolerated. But a cold neck meant trouble, stiffness, fever, coughs that lasted until spring. So that block of wood wasn't about sleeping well. It was about not dying in your sleep. Some were hollowed out inside, allowing warm ash or small coals to be tucked within, enough to retain heat but not burn. Skilled hands carved them into neck-cradling arches. Others just used a round log. If it rolled out mid-sleep, you'd wake up, but at least you'd still be alive. Children hated the wooden pillows at first, but eventually, they learned to sleep still, with their heads balanced, mouths shut tight to avoid inhaling the cold. Some even tied cloth from their heads to the pillow to keep it in place. You once called your mother odd for sleeping on a board, stiff as a chopping block, until you tried stuffing straw into a cloth sack and woke up with a sore neck, a numb face, and ice in your hair. Some wrapped the wood in dry straw for insulation. Others tied a cloth around it to soften the contact. Either way, the wooden pillow became one of the most carefully protected items in the house. When everyone turned in for the night, you'd see it sitting in its proper place on the straw bedding, lightly draped in a worn brown cloth. And you know what? There were unexpected benefits. Wooden pillows supported proper posture and prevented back pain. Old folks in the village used to say, "Soft pillows bend backs." Wood keeps you straight and alive. There is no scientific proof. But your great-grandfather, who lived to 94 with the same oak block under his neck for half a century, probably agreed. Even cats like the wooden pillow. Not to sleep on, but to chew. You've woken more than once to the sound of your cat gnawing the edge like a wooden mouse. So people started tying catnip or dried beans near their pillows to lure the cat into curling up nearby instead of destroying it. There was nothing fancy about any of this. No lace, no embroidered pillowcases. But in the frostbitten dark beyond the walls, in a straw-roofed house where the wind howled all night, a sturdy wooden block that kept your head off the cold floor and shielded the back of your neck from icy drafts. That wasn't just a hunk of wood. It was the backbone of survival. And when you wake, neck relaxed, head clear, and see the sun shyly peeking through the frozen fence, you realize you've made it through another night, not by luck, but thanks to a chunk of rough timber quietly doing its job, keeping your head warm and keeping you here. Back pain wasn't considered an illness in the medieval world. It was destiny. Plowing fields, hauling water, carrying firewood, hours of chopping logs followed by kneeling to mend clothes by the hearth. Every day wore down your spine like an old wooden bridge, creaking, warped, and on the verge of collapse. No padded chairs, no spring mattresses. No one is teaching you to sit with good posture. And yet, the people closest to the earth discovered how to heal themselves with the one thing everyone had: the world itself. Not garden dirt, but living earth, damp, warm, packed firm, shaped by hand to cradle your back like a carpenter who knew your spine by heart. In many rural areas, people didn't sleep on beds. They built the end of the floor into a raised platform, called the sleeping ground. By day, it was a place to sit. By night, they'd spread straw and lie down. But the secret was in the backrest. The ground behind you was sculpted in a gentle curve, just enough to match the natural arc of your spine. No pillow, no sagging straw mat, and most importantly, warmth. You first lay there one evening, your back aching so badly you thought it might snap in two. Your great-grandmother pointed at the little mound of earth and simply said, "Lie there. Don't move." At first you scoffed. What could a pile of dirt possibly do? But within minutes your spine felt like it had slipped back into place. Not comfortable, but aligned, grounded. Right. Some families mixed earth with hearth ash or rice husk mud to help it retain heat longer. When yesterday's ashes were still warm, they packed them into the backrest, covered them with dry straw, and pressed their backs against it. The warmth seeped in slowly, gently, like a mother's hand resting on your skin, traveling from the surface to the deepest ache. That pain from carrying water all day? Gone. Or at least, quieted. In winter, the ground was warmer than the air, especially ground nurtured by kitchen smoke and human footsteps. Some homes even built earth-backed benches, the elder's corner. Grandmothers sat there all afternoon, back to the wall, rubbing their joints and softly humming. They didn't know anatomy, but they knew their bodies, the way the earth does, without words, through feel. Some even used warm earth as a compress. Mud mixed with ash was slathered on aching backs, wrapped in leaves and tied with twine. A homemade heating pad, no electricity, no herbs. Each night, you'd see your father lying face down by the fire, his back covered in dirt, his face blank. But come morning, he'd stand straight without a groan. Proof enough. And the children? They played on that earth all day. They learned to sit without slouching, and to lie down without cricking their necks. How? By copying the grown-ups, not one shouting, "Sit up straight." But those who modeled, back against the earth, silent, patient. The nobles had carved chairs, fur-lined cushions, and massage tubs with perfumed oils. Yet some suffered from aching backs their whole lives without ever knowing why. Meanwhile, the peasants, who sat on the earth, slept on the earth, and let the earth teach them, had already learned the most significant lesson. When you have nothing to lean on what has always been there. Silent, steady, and generous enough to carry your body day after day. The ground. And so, in your little thatched house, no mattress, no pillow, just a slight rise in the floor beneath your back. You lie down, close your eyes, and feel yourself finally unclench. The earth is holding you now. You can rest, at least for tonight. When the cold seeps into your very dreams, when the whole family is curled up in dry straw, hands wrapped in grass, neck resting on a wooden pillow, there is still one last thing to be brought out. Softly, steadily, like the final ember rekindled in the heart, a lullaby. In the medieval world, lullabies weren't just for children. They were survival skills disguised in gentle rhythms. They were lessons passed down through melody. The footprints of those who came before, left behind for those who would follow through the dark, unrelenting winters. You still remember the first lullaby your grandmother ever sang. It didn't rhyme. It had no chorus. Just a few lines repeated over and over. Cover your neck tight. Don't face the wind. Wake up when the fire dims. Feed the stove with dry kindling. As a child, you thought she was telling a story. It wasn't until you were older that you realized she was teaching you how to survive. Every line had a reason. Cover your ears early. Don't let the wind creep in. Because on sub-zero nights, a breeze could leave you waking with a headache that lasted for days. Never sleep on an empty belly. Keep a roasted potato in hand. Hunger brought nightmares, but a hot potato warmed the palms like a rustic heat pack. If the cat sleeps by your knees, the cold won't bite tonight. Superstitious, maybe, but cats always found the warmest spot in the house. For adults, lullabies were comfort. After a long day of toil, when every other sound had faded, a quiet voice, your mother's, your grandmother's, or even your own, would hum loud enough to melt the frost around your heart. No instrument, no poetry, just a voice steady enough, low enough to teach your pulse how to slow again. Some families had a collection of lullabies, one to soothe a child to sleep, one to remind them how to tie their coats tighter, one to warn them when snow was coming. If it rains, run for the eaves. If it's white, heap up the straw. Others sounded odd, songs about trees, fire, or owls flying through the night. But every strange image was a survival code. Which paths not to walk, which sounds dangerous, how the moonlight looked the night before a freeze. You used to think lullabies were soft, maybe even weak. But then one night, coming home late from watching the sheep with the wind howling through your sleeves and your hands too numb to work the latch, you remembered an old verse. Face the wind bowed, shoulder turned east, back to back, we keep the heat. You followed it, and the cold eased. You smiled, not from joy, but from realizing that the lullaby was still there. Like an invisible blanket tucked over you by a mother long gone. Lullabies never vanish. They live in memory, in breath, in instincts you didn't know you'd learned. Like checking the heart before bed, stuffing grass into your shoes without being told, or humming nonsense to soothe a feverish sibling into sleep. In an age without writing, without schools, without handbooks on how to endure winter, lullabies were the quietest libraries. No one wrote them down. No one read them aloud. Just a voice, steady in the dark. And if you could still hear it, you were still alive. So tonight, when the fire dims, when the wind taps gently on the wall, you hum a lullaby again. Not to lull a child to sleep, but to remind yourself that you are part of something greater. A chain of voices passed from generation to generation, whispering into winter itself. We're still here. There are winter nights that last so long you forget that time is still moving. The wind howls against the walls. The fire has dwindled to a single lazy ember and your stomach is utterly empty. No more turnips. No more thin porridge. Not even fresh straw to line the floor. Nothing. Just a vast, quiet hollowness that stretches on and on, as stubborn as a 2-week-old loaf of bread. And then, someone laughs. Not loudly. Just a soft snort from the nose, as your grandmother recounts how the neighbor's cat, desperate from the cold, licked a frozen door latch and got its tongue stuck. Nothing remarkable, but that small laugh in the night stillness is like a sudden spark flaring up from ashes you thought were dead. Medieval people understood this well. Sometimes there's nothing left to keep warm with, no pig fat, firewood, or ashes to soak your feet in. But if you can still laugh, you still have the strongest invisible cloak. Not everyone knows how to laugh when they're freezing, and not everyone wants to. But those who survived the harshest winters all had one thing in common. They could laugh at themselves. They could look at misery until it became ridiculous. They'd sigh and mutter, "It's so cold tonight. Even ghosts have to wrap up." Then chuckle together with cracked lips and chattering teeth. Laughter flushed your cheeks, quickened your heart. It made others laugh too, even if they didn't know why. It didn't patch the holes in the roof or stop the snow from falling, but it yanked you out of despair with a foolish little thread called hope. Some older men recalled winters when they lost everything, crops, oxen, even their wooden pillows, and still laughed at how Grandma spilled the only pot of soup, and the entire family crawled on the floor licking it up like it was a sacred ritual. Flavorful, though, he'd grin. Or old ladies chuckling as they told how Grandpa fell into a frozen stream fetching firewood and came back soaked, with a frog clinging to his trousers, which they promptly named the Fire Guardian. From then on, they kept a round stone by the hearth in its honor every winter. When you've lost everything, you still have laughter. It's the final refusal to give in to darkness. It says, "You can take all I have, but I still have one joke left." Strangely, once you laugh, your body relaxes, your eyes brighten, and your chest, stiff from the cold, expands slightly. Laughter is fuel you don't have to chop, a fire you don't have to light, a song you don't need words for. Some nights, you're curled up with your little sibling, both stomachs growling. But your mind still thinks up something absurd. If it gets colder, my nose might fall off before the rooster crows. Your sibling snorts. Just a little. But enough to say, we're still here. And we still have joy. And you know what? Laughter doesn't make you less poor. But it lets you be poor without breaking. It enables you to survive the cold without freezing from the inside out. So don't hesitate. When you have nothing, laugh. Laugh because the night will eventually end. Laugh because the snow will melt, even if slowly. Laugh because surviving another winter is an unawarded triumph worth being proud of. Laugh, like your ancestors did, beside cold ashes in crumbling straw huts, in nights when nothing was left but each other. And with that laughter, they got through the winter, passing down not just techniques, but a spirit, to shiver, but never fear, to struggle but never surrender. That's the most beautiful inheritance. Not firewood, not grass, not wooden pillows or lullabies, but the laughter that bursts forth on nights that feel hopeless. And you, laughing in the coldest season, are carrying that tradition forward, brilliantly, and oh, so human.